familiar with it. So what are adjectives for that would describe you for your names?
I still remember mine from the name game. It was
Balance Bobby.
Does it have to be like the same?
Yeah, it's the first letter.
It's not an adjective, but I was Emily the elephant to all my friends.
I like that. Emily the elephant. I like it. I recently read that elephants, their brains react the same way when they see us as our brains react when we see puppies. So an elephant's like, we're super cute. So it's great. Okay, so scope. I'm sure you've heard about it, used it, maybe had problems because of scope with yesterday's problems. I know sometimes for me, I'm like, oh, it's a scope problem. It's always get you. But scope, it's pretty much where you have access to certain variables. There's some variables that are called global variables. They're accessible anywhere. Then there's more local variables. We'll talk about why you shouldn't have global variables in a second, but local variables are pretty much anything you say var variable name. And its scope is based on where you declare the variable. So inside of a function, you declare a variable. You can't access that variable outside of the function by calling the variable name. And ES6 introduced block scoping, which is pretty much using curly brackets to contain local variables. But we won't worry about that here, but it's just something to keep in mind. So let's look at an example. We're going to see lots of examples on this because that's the best way to sort of get your mind around scope. So in this case, we have n and we have num. Both are within this function scope, and we return n plus num. We're not accessing n or num outside of the function, so add 5 with 3 as n should work fine. And it does. It gives us 8. We declare num outside of the function, and then we have n and num here, and we return n plus num. And we pass in this num here. Would this work? So yeah, so num, we have access to num here. This num and this one are the same thing. These two are different ones, but this is pretty much just the number 5. So it works fine. But if we put the number 8 here instead of the variable num, we would be adding 3 and 8. So that's something to keep in mind with the scoping. And this gives us 8 as well. Okay, what about this one, where we have num up here declared, and then we have n as our parameter, and we're returning num plus n. This one will also work. This is using because you can access variables outside of the function if it's num is at a more generalized scope than n is. So n is only accessible within the function, but num is accessible in this whole thing. So you can go inwards in scoping, but you can't access outwards, if that makes sense. So this also gives us 8. Now what about this one? We have create num, it's a function, and we declare num in there. And then we have add 5, and it has a parameter n, and it returns n plus num.
No.
Exactly. Because we don't have access to num because we only have access to num within the create num function. So we would get a reference error. So when you see something like reference error, a variable is not defined, that normally has to do with scoping in some way.
Right, because that variable only stays within that function.
Exactly. The second one, yeah. This one, yeah?
If the console log was inside the function,
Mm-hmm.
would would that still work?
Yeah, if we had the console log up here before the return, because we have access to num within the function, because it's like more on the outer area of it, so we can access num in any of it.
So you can invoke a console log inside the function? Because right, you're
Yeah, I don't know if that would.
you're invoking as a function inside
Yeah.
the function, yeah.
Yeah, and that's called invoking a function within a function would be recursion. We'll talk a lot about that next Saturday afternoon. But yeah, it would also be easier to just like console log n plus num. But I think that would give you the same. Okay. So this one is a similar thing of not working because we have create num and then we invoke it, but we're not assigning anything to the return or like grabbing the return value of create num. So we also can't just like console log num because we don't have access to it. It's in here. This is why clean code really is important because you can see the scope of a variable super clearly with clean code if you're indenting correctly. And so if you're trying to console log num and the console log's over here, but you declare it within this, it should be, that should throw up a red flag in your brain of like, I'm trying to access it, not within the scope. So that's one of the reasons why clean code like really helps with that. In this case though, we create a new variable num, and we assign it to the return value create num, which is 5. So in this case, we can console log it because they're within the same scope. So this one works. So functions create new scope. Before, they have a really great way of explaining it like a glass mirror, one-way glass. Whatever the police people use, with the brackets, you can grab things from the outside like num1 and see it within the curly brackets, but you can't use num2 outside of the curly brackets, so it sort of contains the variables. So in this case, we can print the num. We can console log num1 because we have access to it. But num2, we're going to get a reference error because it's like, I don't know what this is, because it doesn't know what's within the curly brackets. Global scope. Global scope is the window in your browser. There are certain variables within your global scope that you're able to access. But you generally don't want to assign things to the global scope, A, because that could mess something up if you name it the same name as something in your global scope already. And also, then people have access to your variables, which generally is not great practice. Not that you'd have anything like super secretive per se, but still, you don't want people knowing what your variables are and changing them, because when they're on the global scope, they can be changed in the browser. So anything that's declared without the var keyword is attached to the global scope. So even in your for loop, you want to say like var I equals 0. Always use var. Some people in ES6 you might see let and const. Those are just fancy vars with certain rules attached to it. But yeah, always declare it with that. Don't just be like, this is my string, and like, because then my string is accessible everywhere. Which, if you want it accessible everywhere, you should declare it in a place where it's accessible to all the things you want. Yeah. Great question. Let is pretty much var, where you can reassign it, but that one does some scoping. So that's a little bit more strict in the scoping. And then const, you can't ever reassign it. So you can do like const my string, and will always be the value hello world, and you're not going to be able to say like my string equals and reassign it. Let, you can reassign. Yes. Yeah. So ES6 is like, let's just never use var and be super declarative of will this variable ever be reassigned or, you know. So that's sort of like the path they're going towards. But var still works in ES6. This is a great example of why you don't want to do something with the global variable. So we have a variable, we assign it true. We have a function that says whether or not that variable is true. Then we have this other function, and this variable is now reassigned to false, not just within this function, but within this whole scope because we didn't use the var keyword. And then when we invoke it, it reassigns it. So if we have like var has candy, like we have a, I don't know, this is small. We're in the classroom and we want to see if like someone has candy. So we have var has candy is true, and we have function is there candy, and return has candy true. So this is gonna, this would be the same as saying like var is true equals has candy triple equals true, just like checking, like, so you can just shorten it by saying like return whatever this return value will be. So if has candy is false, it'll return false. And then if we do the don't mind me, maybe it's the thief of the candy or something, then we reassign it without the var. This is just like reassigning the same one that's here. Then if we do a check, or we invoke it, and if is there candy is true, we're gonna console log, yay. Otherwise, we're gonna console log who took my candy. So in this case, because we're reassigning has candy to false, we're expecting that is there candy to be returning false. So we're going to get into this else block, which works. It's not, in this case, it's a pretty small example, but if you have a big application and maybe it's a like API key or something, or like a user's password, you want to be super careful, like later on in your app you're reassigning something somewhere that you're not expecting it, and the app will behave in a different way. If we add var to this, it should not have that problem. So then it's creating a new variable has candy that's only within this. Now this function's not really doing anything. It's making a variable and then nothing. But the behavior is different. Yeah, I don't think there's a way that you can like say this is this scope. Yeah. It depends. In the framework and stuff, a lot of times at the top of JavaScript files, you're importing in different libraries. That's like what goes to the top. But yeah, its scope is more defined based on like the functions you're wrapping it in, and most things will be in a function in some way or another. Okay, cool. So a function in a function. That sometimes it can get tricky if you have a lot of like nested things and functions and whatnot, accessing variables. If you're ever unsure what a variable is, it's safest just to like console log it, make sure it is what you think it is. But in this case, we have favorite, and we have this outer function that creates a new variable favorite, and then it has this inner function. This favorite variable is not going to be the one up here, it's going to be this one. So it finds the one that's like most within its scope. So it's like looking for this favorite variable. It's not within its scope, so it goes one layer out. Is it here? Okay, it is here, it found it. If there wasn't one here, it would go next layer out and it would find this favorite. So it's looking for the one that's like closest within its scope. But it's nice to name your variables different names so that you're not in an instance where you're expecting to console log out Granny Smith and you're console logging out Fuji, yeah. So, yeah, that's one reason why but yeah, if there's like a variable, it's like 3 layers up, it's not going to grab that one instead of the one layer up. Parameters. Similar with the one before, what is it going to log out here? So it's logging out favorite. Which favorite will it be logged out? Will it be the argument Fuji that matches this parameter, or will it be Granny Smith? Exactly, yeah, because it's the same scope as before of like bar favorite equals Fuji. Favorite is within this scope. So it's going layer by layer to find that variable. Yeah. So that's why it is nice that if you declare a variable, maybe it's a common like user ID or something like that. It's going to be whatever. JavaScript is smart in guessing which variable you want because it goes layer by layer.
Can you give us an instance where you use a global variable?
So most of the time that I've used global variables, I'm not going to lie, it's been sort of like a hack workaround because I've been like on a time crunch at a hackathon or something, and I'm like, let's just put it in the global variable. I would say very rarely would you put it in a global variable. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'll look it up. I'm sure there's one that will come to me and I'll let you know. Okay. One thing that's really fun is immediately invoked function expressions. It doesn't come into play a lot just because normally you don't want to like invoke a function right as you make it. Otherwise, well, yeah. But sometimes it's fun and sometimes it is necessary. And it's totally possible. So you have like this boring old function like it console logs a thing, and you invoke it with a string like you would that you've been seeing. Another thing you can do is have this function here and invoke it right away. So you technically don't even need to name it in this case unless you want to use it like afterwards. But the way you do it is you wrap the function in parentheses and then you invoke it right away with parentheses like you would any other function. Does that make sense? It's a little funky, but sometimes it's really fun to do just for fun in a REPL. But yeah. But you have to wrap it in the parentheses to invoke it. Hoisting. We talked a little bit about this yesterday when we talked about types and the different function types. There's the function expression and the declarative function, or function declaration. Also, when JavaScript runs your file, it does two passes with it. First, it collects all the variable names. So when you have like var x, it evaluates that, but it doesn't evaluate anything after the equal sign. So it goes through and it sort of like gathers all the like big picture stuff. That's also when it gathers the function, like function name type functions. And so it gets all that information, and then it does the second pass, and it goes line by line and like actually runs your code. So in this case, we have no x. We haven't said var x anywhere, so when it does its first pass, it doesn't find a variable named x. So when you try to console log x, it's saying like reference error, like there is no x. But in this case, when we have var x equals 2, the first pass, it sees, okay, there is an x variable. Doesn't care what it is yet. It's not going to worry about that. And so when you console log x, it's going to console log undefined because it immediately sets all of your variables to undefined before it runs your code the second time, the second pass. So that's when sometimes you'll see like x is not a function if you try to invoke x, and that's because x, if you said var x equals and then a function that like console logs 2 or something, if you tried to invoke x, currently x is equal to undefined because var x, it'll just set that to undefined until it hits it. So if you try to call it up here, it's going to say x isn't a function that's undefined, like what are you doing? So yeah. It like hoists all the variable names up top. And then here are the different ways to call a function. So as before, I was saying like type error like say hi is not a function. That's because at this moment, say hi equals undefined. It's not, it doesn't know that this function is a thing yet. But here, it hoists all of these functions, say hi kind of functions to the top along with all the variable names. So this is one of those cases where you might be like, I say hi as a function, like it's right there. So yeah, that's one of those like order of operation errors you might get. Does this make sense? Cool. Oh, are there any questions on scope or anything?
Is there a list of errors and symbolic? I mean, you can infer from the name, obviously, but.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to talk a little bit more about errors and reading them on our last lecture of today when we talk about debugging. But there's actually, error is a type in JavaScript. And it has all of these, let me see if I can make this bigger. It has all of these different errors. So this is the type error. So it creates an instance representing an error that occurs when a variable or parameter is not of the valid type. So that's a type error because it's saying, like, oh, undefined is not a function. So these are, and you can like look through the documentation and see more about them, but these are the like list.
Wait, so like when you use typo,
Mhm.
it can return error? Or is it like a type of object?
Maybe. I think. Oh, I'm sorry. I misspoke. It's a built-in object. So it's like an error is like an array or a function. It's like something that has certain properties assigned to it. JavaScript has different ways of behaving with it. Browsers behave with it different ways. And you can create your own errors. That's really fun. You'll find when you start working with frameworks, you get drawn to ones that have really nice errors. Because some frameworks, it's like an error that like, they just have like some very generic errors that are thrown. And you're like, this means nothing to me. but some will be like, oh, on this line, this is wrong, and like, look at this documentation, and it'll have links and their errors, and you're like, I love you forever. So errors are really helpful, and definitely get used to reading them, and we're going to talk about some good ways to read them later today. Okay, cool. I'm going to stop.